So, I just saw a video that was supposed to be about Matt Walsh explaining why body count matters. And I thought, finally, something we can agree on. Yes, body count matters. Why does body count matter? Well, mainly because rather than giving in to the kitsch novelty stylings of the Aerosmith Run DMC pairing or even the Anthrax Public Enemy collaboration, Body Count actually incorporated the then popular Bay Area thrash stylings with the emergent style of gangster rap to create a sound that not only would be highly influential 10 years later on the new metal movement, but also was extremely influential in the development of power groove with their halftime thrash riffs that were would later go on to be a tremendous influence on Pantera and all of the mid to late 90s power groove bands. And then I realized what he was actually talking about. And so this is Matt Walsh talking about why body count, i.e. the number of sexual partners that a woman has had, matters to men. Now, it's interesting with Matt Walsh because, as controversial and understandably controversial a figure as he is, he's really not, to me, the most redolent or off-putting person at the Daily Wire. As I've said before, my opinions, my perspectives are neither fully liberal or fully conservative, and so consequently, there will be some things I agree with from these commentators and some things I don't. And the Daily Wire has kind of a wide gamut of commentators of different styles. You have people who have brilliant philosophical insights like Jordan Peterson, people who have interesting thoughts on the arts and humanities like Andrew Klavan, and then you have unhinged demonic hellspawns like Candace Owens and Michael Knowles. And Matt Walsh, for all of his faults, really only falls kind of in the middle for me. And the reason for that is because ultimately, as I kind of evaluate not just the positions that he holds, but what kind of person he is in holding these positions, I find that he seems to be really just sort of a garden variety ultra-conservative, albeit one with a more charismatic flair for the articulate that allows him to delve into and elaborate on why he believes what he believes in a more thorough and insightful manner than ultra conservatives, of the past, the Bill O'Reillys, etc., and that sort of thing. And I understand. I certainly understand why he would be such an iconoclastic firebrand within the conservative movement, especially as he's come to the forefront of the anti-trans movement and that sort of thing. I do want to say, by the way, that there have been things like where he has had to get round-the-clock security at his home because people have done things like come to his house and take photographs of his children playing in the front yard and things like that. That is a level of fucked up that is completely unconscionable, and wherever you stand on any issue, you should never stoop to harassing somebody's children. So anyway, you shouldn't harass anybody, but you should not stoop to involving somebody's child-age children. I'm not talking about things like Donald Trump Jr., where we're talking about an adult who's consciously and intentionally participating in something. But you shouldn't bring child-age children into it. That is just a level of low and despicable that is beneath contempt and certainly beneath honor and respect. Anyway, but ultimately, as I look at the kind of person Matt Walsh is, as disagreeable and curmudgeonly as he is, he does not seem to take gleeful, grinning, chuckling pleasure in the pain and misery of the world as Michael Knowles does, and he doesn't seem to fly off the handle in these violent, unhinged rages calling for the violent mistreatment of people that he disagrees with, like what Candace Owens does. Rather, he just seems to be a very verbally belligerent and blunt sort of person that refuses to back down in his positions. But what I have to give him is that he always, whatever his position, whatever his take on his position, it's always a prompt for me to provide some kind of insight of my own. And I appreciate that. Now, I want to unpack the things that he talked about here in getting into body count and women's body count and all of that. Rest assured that my opinions are ultimately going to be infinitely more liberal than Matt Walsh on this issue. But I am going to unpack a few things that I think are important to address and discuss. And I say that because one of the first things he brings up structurally is a very important point about argumentation, especially as we see emerging from the left in recent years. His commentary begins with commenting, and I'll put a link below if you want to see specifics so that I can just flow with the discussion and not have to, constantly re-encapsulate too much. But he talks about early on this article from a feminist, left-leaning blogger, commentator, journalist who is talking about how men's condemnation of women's body count appears to be an emergent trend and appears to be back on the rise, that men condemning women for having a high number of sexual partners seems to be back on the rise. And Matt Walsh points out rightly that nowhere in the article does the woman actually make the case for why men shouldn't care about body count. She just says that they shouldn't, in point of fact. And that's what I wanted to step into first, because this is actually a very important point to consider. No matter what your position, left, right, center, or anything else, you should never be of the mindset that your position is so systemically and structurally sound that you don't need to defend it, that all you need to do is point to someone who doesn't agree with you and say bad person, and you've already won the argument. This is very true. And this actually, if you care about the recent resurgent rise in extreme right-wing values that seems to be presenting itself in this country right now, if you care about that, this is actually one of the first things you need to understand. For far too long, see, the people on the left, whatever they want to say about being on the vanguard of progressive values and that sort of thing, a lot of their ideas, fundamentally left-leaning progressive ideas, have been the establishment norm for probably about 50 years now. Ideas about the acceptance of for example, the intermingling of the races, free association among races rather than kind of the dogmatic separation of them, attitudes about free love, pursuing love and marriage and relationships for the sake of the happiness of the individuals involved rather than larger societal concerns. Open acceptance of people on the LGBT spectrum and that sort of thing. All of those things, while certainly challenged at different levels by conservative groups, have been things that have been fundamentally mainstream ideas for a long time now. And the problem is that the left has started assuming that those ideas are so the validity of those ideas is so obvious and so entrenched that they don't have to present any ideological defense of or explanation for their ideas. They just have to point to people who disagree with them and say bad. Now, there's an old saying that to secure peace is to prepare for war, and that's certainly true in the in the realm of philosophies and ideologies as well. Whatever you believe, if you want those ideas and those beliefs to remain in the mainstream and remain at the forefront of our commonly held value system, then you need to consistently be able to argue for and advocate for those ideas that you hold, rather than just pointing at people who disagree and saying bad. I'll give you an example, and one that actually involves Matt Walsh. A while ago, maybe a few months ago, he posted a commentary on his podcast at raising the question, asking the question, why is it racist to point out that black people like chicken and waffles? And Media Matters, who does a lot of anti-Daily Wire commentary, just took the video of his asking that question and reposted it along with a headline that said something like, Matt Walsh asks why is it inappropriate or why is it wrong to point out that black people like chicken and waffles? And that was it. They didn't offer any commentary. They didn't delve into it at all. They didn't elaborate on the point. Now, the thing is, on the surface, that serves as that is certainly a valid question, and a refusal to answer that question, and I'll answer it in a moment, but a refusal to answer that question is only going to open people up to Matt Walsh, because here's the thing. to the person on the fence about these issues, the person who has who's genuinely asking that question in good faith, what they're presented with is one side that appears to be asking that question, at least at the rhetorical level, and then another side that says you're either with us or against us, and if you're on the fence, you're no different from the pieces of shit that disagree with us. And to the person on the fence, what you're doing is not presenting a valid argument for why they should be on your side. You're presenting, rather, what you're doing is giving the other side an opportunity to open their arms to them, to ingratiate themselves to them, and welcome in those people who are on the fence, presenting themselves as being the intellectually open and intellectually rigorous people in the face of the closed system, the Iron Curtain that demands blind obedience. And when you set that up, now, again, as we've established, the ideas, most of the ideas espoused by the Daily Wire are just as imperialistic, just as dictatorial and imperialistic as anything offered by the other side. But they can you're at least giving them the opportunity to appear more open than they actually are. Now, to answer Matt Walsh's actual question about chicken and waffles, the origin of chicken and waffles is not necessarily what's controversial. Chicken and waffles itself was actually a delicacy that developed, I believe, I can't confirm this, but what I've heard is that it developed because jazz musicians would play gigs that lasted until 3 or 4 in the morning, and at the end of those gigs, they didn't know whether or not they should order chicken or waffles, or breakfast or dinner, so they would order both, i.e. chicken and waffles, and that's where the delicacy developed. Now, the real issue comes down to the issue of fried chicken, which is an ingredient in chicken and waffles. Fried chicken has long-standing negative racist connotations associated with it. And the reason for that is that all of the stereotypes and attitudes that were imposed on black slaves, later black sharecroppers, and so on and so forth through Jim Crow and all of that, had their cultural origins with the European aristocracy. They were negative attitudes that the European aristocrats would hold towards the serf class within their own countries, with their own countries of origin. And so those kind of feudalistic aristocratic attitudes carried over into the relationship between slaves and slave owners, and then sharecroppers and landowners and that kind of thing. And one of those, outstanding among those things, was the attitude that finger food was something of the lower class and considered a lesser dish, a food for lesser people, because it was not eaten with utensils. Now, yes, these were attitudes that were pushed by the same European aristocracies that would defecate in the hallways of their castles. I mean, hypocrisy kind of makes the world go round. But that is the origin of that attitude. And fried chicken specifically, it's also, by the way, where the negative connotations about watermelon developed, because watermelon is finger food, but it was also an early cash crop for sharecroppers, and consequently it had this it was given to this negative connotation, these negative connotations about lower class behavior, laziness, that sort of thing, all of those things that were associated with finger foods. Fried chicken specifically emerged as kind of the poster child of those negative attitudes because of the movie Birth of a Nation, where there's a scene in Birth of a Nation where a group of black radicals overpowers and conquers the halls of the Senate and Congress, and they celebrate by putting their feet up on the desks and eating fried chicken. And so from that scene in that very, very racist movie, that specific connotation around fried chicken combined with the other stuff I mentioned developed. That's where that came from. That's an honest and sincere and totally reasonable answer to Matt Walsh's question. And what it does is, by answering that, by being willing to provide that answer, and that intellectually rigorous answer, it demonstrates to the person on the fence that a thoughtful intellectual basis for one's beliefs and one's reasons for holding certain attitudes is not a foregone conclusion for only one side. So that's why it's important to actually address the actual arguments. That's why even when I do or don't agree with certain things the Daily Wire says, it's still great to unpack my disagreement and provide an intellectual foundation for it, rather than just pointing at the people I disagree with and saying bad. So that's a valid point to bring up. Now let's get to his actual justifications for why body count matters. And like I said, I'm ultimately going to come down on a position that's infinitely more liberal than any position Matt Walsh has ever held about human sexuality. But I want to begin by talking about a couple of valid things that a very valid concern that he brings up. In his list of why men should care about body count, the first thing he brings up is one that is totally valid for men, women, and everybody else, and that is STDs. If you are going to be sexually active, you need to stay on top of your STD health, your sexual health. I do. Any other sexually active adult should stay on top of it. Anyone that's not in a committed monogamous relationship should stay on top of that. And he is right to say that, yes, if the more people a person has been with means the more potential exposures to STDs. That is a totally reasonable concern, and it's not a put down of anybody. It's just the reality of the situation. So yes, if you're going to be sexually active, you should stay on top of your sexual health. Now, the next thing that he extrapolates from that is another deeply ingrained prejudicial attitude that's worthy of unpacking as far as its origins. He says that if a woman has been with 25 guys, men will naturally assume she must have herpes or something, is his words. It's interesting that he picks herpes. Also, I don't know why he picks the number 25. I don't know if I would seriously doubt that Matt Walsh would consider 24 sexual partners to be acceptable. So it's probably just an arbitrarily high number for him. But anyway, or in his mind, and I say that because I don't want to sound like I'm trying to put him down as like he can't get laid or something like that. But anyway, it's probably just what he regards as a high number in his mind. But anyway, so the thing about herpes, it's interesting that he goes to that one because concerns moral panic and social panic around herpes is to some degree manufactured. Now, to be very clear, there's nothing good about having herpes. You don't benefit anything from having herpes. And in the worst case scenarios, yes, it will cause potentially painful and unsightly sores on your face and other areas. And you may indeed have to take careful steps to make sure that those sores don't do things like leak onto other people and gross stuff like that. So like I said, nothing good about herpes, but at the same time, the moral hysteria, the public hysteria around herpes is fairly manufactured and highly overblown. The origin of the extremely negative connotations about herpes dates back about 30 some odd years to the late 80s, early 90s, when the human race was gripped in fear by the widespread AIDS pandemic. I was born in '83, so I'm old enough, to remember actually what it was like in the, if you want to say, the golden era of the AIDS crisis. It was the attitudes, people's attitudes were, people were highly tightly wound about sex, and understandably so. And as depraved and despicable as it sounds, the ultra-evangelical Christian right wing in the United States was actually in many ways jumping for joy about the AIDS crisis, because now finally they had an objective reason they could point to about why people shouldn't be having sex for fun. And so they bankrolled, or they banked on this being that AIDS and HIV infection would take off in the heterosexual community the way it took off in the gay community. And while certainly HIV infection is something that heterosexual persons should be concerned about and should take steps to avoid and engage in preventative care to avoid getting it and that sort of thing, and should take it seriously if they are infected. While all of that is true, HIV certainly did not take off in the heterosexual community the way it took off in the gay community. And so because of that, extreme social conservatives were not able to browbeat heterosexual free love advocates the way they could so easily browbeat homosexuals in general. So they started casting about for something that they could demonize, and they settled on herpes because it's an extraordinarily common occurrence that happens among a great many people. And so there were all of these publicity campaigns in the media about herpes, trying to scare the hell out of heterosexual people about the potential for herpes and all of that, when in reality, the majority of people who have herpes never develop symptoms, and something like a third of the adult population has herpes and doesn't even know it. So it is most often an extraordinarily benign and dismissible occurrence. Like I said, it's not something you want to get. It's not something that you benefit in any way, shape, or form from having. But it's not the end of the world like people like Matt Walsh would make it out to be. And by the way, the TV series Adam Ruins Everything actually in there did a segment on sexual health that covered exactly that, the whole herpes hysteria of the early 90s, if you want some historical reference points on that, citation reference points on that. Anyway, so then he goes on to say, a man wants a woman who is chaste, so this is quoting him, chaste, self-controlled, dignified, classy, and then he goes on to say that that's simply the right way to be, and that's how men that's how men see women and what men want from women, etc., etc. Well, Matt, I know part of the problem here is that, the thing with Matt Walsh is that he's, as I've said before, so solipsistic that he cannot conceive of other human beings reasonably wanting anything that he himself does not want. And that's I think one of the personality problems with a lot that befalls a lot of social conservatives and ultra conservatives and that sort of thing. Really, pardon me. Really, anybody who is so anybody who's so authoritarian that they just can't conceive of a world of people who are happy not being them. Anyway, but that's very easy to refute, Matt. You will notice that most of the sex industry, most of the pornographic sex industry, the performative sex industry like strip clubs, and even the interactive sex industry like brothels and prostitution and all of that, the overwhelming majority of that is geared towards men. And it's geared towards men simply because men are the ones who are, by and large, interested in large-scale promiscuity. It's no secret that gay men are the most sexually active group among any pairing of genders when it comes to sexuality. And by the same extension, most pornography, gay or straight, panders to the interests of heterosexual men, panders to the interest of men. Sorry, where gay or straight panders to the interest of men. Pornography that panders to the interests of lesbians is a niche market at best. And so, and I say that because even most lesbian pornography is targeted at straight men. And so you're simply wrong. The fact that there is such an there is a thriving sex industry hinged almost entirely on the sexual desires of men puts lie to the idea that men fundamentally want a chaste woman. No, men can certainly see the value in adopting a system of morality that values chastity and values sexual conservatism, if you will. Certainly they can see the value in that and choose to take it on, but fundamentally that's not the default state of men. No, obviously, men fundamentally are fascinated by promiscuity and the idea of widespread sexual availability. And that's what's funny to me, because even the Bible that Matt Walsh bases his sexual morality on is not the Bible that he bases his sexual morality on is not really in favor of the sexual morality that he's pushing. If you think about it, if you read the Old Testament, even the nation of Israel is founded because one man has a drunken five-way with his two wives and their valets. That is certainly not a ringing endorsement of one man, one woman, monogamy, etc. That's actually a pretty, if you ask me, a pretty kinky and sexually freaky way to found an entire nation of people. But anyway, so those ideas about monogamy are actually extrapolations from the Bible, owing largely to the assumption that Paul somehow overrides Jesus, even though Paul is very clear in the Corinthian letter that you're baptized in the name of Jesus, not Paul. In other words, he's the commentator. Jesus is the main guy. Paul is the consultant. But anyway, now people are going to say, well, aren't you a Christian? And yes, I'll address my own sexual morality in a moment to kind of give some perspective. But ultimately, the cultural origins of these attitudes valuing valuing chastity and all of that in women, that ultimately comes. And by the way, to get before I get to that, to get to the rest of it, he talks about saying that men are competitive and want to feel that they've won a great prize. Men will feel ashamed to put a ring on the finger of a woman that half the men have already had a turn with. That it will be embarrassing for men. That's a quote from Matt Walsh. And then he says, women who give it up to anybody are sending a message about how they see their own value and that kind of thing. And so all of that could be valid if you take on by choice the moral code that Matt Walsh is espousing. And I will even say that there can be tremendous value in that moral code under specific circumstances, but it's necessary to understand where that moral code developed. The moral code that Matt Walsh is espousing, the sexual mores of the Old Testament and that kind of thing, came about at a time when there was absolutely no way to verify based on genetic studies or medical testing or anything like that which children belonged to what man. Certainly you had resemblance, but even then it could be sketchy at best. If a woman had a reputation for sleeping around or having sex outside of wedlock, you therefore could not guarantee that the children she gave you would be yours. And so out of that mindset, and the necessity begat of that mindset, the idea of keeping women virginal and pure until they were married off originated. That's where all of that came from. It comes from a time when it was impossible to know for sure if somebody was if your male heir was actually your male heir, and it was considered socially disgraceful and pathetic on the part of a man to be raising and providing for somebody else's child. So the only way to guarantee that was to guarantee that he was providing for the right children and passing his property off to the right offspring was to guarantee the chastity of his spouse, of his partner. So that's where all of that came from. And the thing is, there can be good benefits from that, and I want to get into that in a minute. But ultimately, this idea, I will say fundamentally, this idea that men are competitive and want to feel as if they've accomplished something, that has never been sexually satisfying to me. And maybe I'm just, now I admit to being highly neuroatypical, I am on the spectrum and all of that, but it's always this idea of wanting to feel like the woman was the prize at the end of the prize at the end of the competition never made sense to me. What has always been most sexually arousing to me was the circumstances where, and obviously a great deal of what we find arousing goes into the circumstances of the arousal and that sort of thing. And the circumstances that were always the most sexually appealing to me and the most sexually gratifying to me were the ones where it seemed like we were mutually casting off the mutually casting off the societal expectations that would limit our access to sexuality, and purely enjoying those things, mutually enjoying those things purely for their own sake. That's always been what's been most sexually satisfying to me. And when I've been my experiences in relationships with women have been committed relationships have been largely unsatisfying, because the sex started the getting to the sex and getting to the sex on those terms started to feel like a drudgery. It started to feel like this aggravation, this aggravating thing, this aggravating pursuit that ultimately wasn't worth it. So this idea, again, it ultimately comes down to Matt Walsh just being so solipsistic that he can't fathom anybody genuinely not deriving their meaning and purpose and gratification in life from the things that he values. But that is just so the constant. I for one cannot find any sexual arousal or sexual desire or sexual appeal in a mindset that is constantly stomping on any desire that I could possibly have, and then finally, under the most extreme of arranged, socially approved of circumstances, finally says, okay, you've gotten to the point, you're in a relationship that we as the world, we as the society around you approve of, now have sex and hang a bloody bed sheet in the window. I find no appeal and no enjoyment in that whatsoever. And my only response to a society that tells me that is, well, fuck you. And so it's kind of like a while ago I watched a Michael Knowles presentation at one of these like Young Americans YAF organization events or something, and he was talking to this woman. Stood up. One of the Q&A people was this woman, very kind of standard blue-eyed, blonde-haired debutante type woman, was excited to tell Michael Knowles that she was getting married, and he says, where's the lucky man? And the guy stands up and everybody applauds for him, and he says, he talks, and he's very happy and jubilant and talking about how happy they should be, and he says, you're going to have wonderful babies, and then he smiles and says, and it's lots of fun to make the babies. And like, the way he said that just made my skin crawl, and I'm sure the thing is, I'm sure in his mind he's saying, hey, you got the best prize, you kids won the gold medal, go have fun making the babies, enjoy it. But to me, I just cannot enjoy a sexuality that is under the thumb of the approval of the world at large. My natural attitude is just to tell the world at large to go get bent. I cannot find enjoyment in that attitude. And I just simply have, to me, in my mind, I am a storyteller by nature. I am a creative person by nature, and I don't enjoy, I don't find enjoyment in fitting into a predetermined box. I find enjoyment and fulfillment in writing a story, telling, having my life be a narrative adventure for me, rather than just, you're in this box now, you're in this box now, you're in this box now, and you're dead, so you're in that box now, and done with you. Life should be about enjoyment and enjoying this life and finding fulfillment and unique, interesting experiences in this life, rather than just kind of being shuffled through a system and tossed in a box. And now, as I say that, I'm 40 and unmarried, and I have no long-term plans, and the loneliness of my life certainly creeps up on me. So I'm certainly not suggesting that this is any guarantee of perfection. It's just that I can't, as much as I might want to have intimacy and long-term connection and that sort of thing, I just can't do it in this weird, creepy, stilted, prefabricated way that people like Michael Knowles and Matt Walsh, conservative Catholics, have worked out. It just feels unpleasant to me, and I've tried going down that road. Now, the thing of it is, ultimately, at the end of the day, what Matt Walsh is actually, I don't like to just default to people I disagree with having some kind of mental health issue or something like that, but for the sake of conversation, I think this is worth considering. And it's not a mental health condition, it's a fairly common perspective people have. But there is what's known as the Madonna-whore complex. And the idea that men, it's something that men experience where they are fundamentally, they fundamentally have to reconcile two concepts of femininity that they have: the pure virginal, loving, purely loving, nurturing, Mother Nature kind of compassion and support and love that they got from their mothers, and the sexual desires that they have towards women, which are to have, which are that's the Madonna complex. And then the whore aspect of the complex is being unable to reconcile the Madonna complex, with the whore complex, which is the reality that what they want is, what they sexually desire is the proverbial freak in the sheets, the promiscuous, sexually available woman that's down for everything and wants to fuck all willy-nilly. And it is this confluence of biology and sociology that men have to confront. And it's a part of our natural psychological development. And a healthy integration of the Madonna-whore, if men are not able to integrate those concepts, see, what they ultimately have to confront is the reality that the Madonna figure in their minds, their mothers, this figure of purity and pure love and innocence in their minds, created them through the reality of how she created them was by engaging in the seemingly dirty, awful, grotesque, fundamentally absurd act of human reproduction that they want to incur with other women. They lack the ability to accept that, as one of my professors in college wonderfully put it, some people don't want to admit that they were born naked in bed with a woman. But that's ultimately what it comes down to. They want to keep this concept of innocent virginal purity about their mothers and not have to reconcile the reality that all of that gross, sexy stuff that they want to do with women out there was things that were done to their mother. They don't want, and they don't want to do that. And it ultimately comes down to kind of an arrested development thing of not wanting to accept that your parents were just as lustful and horny as you are. That kind of thing, wanting to keep your parents on a shelf and not accept that they were just as lustful and horny as you are. That's what the Madonna-whore complex ultimately comes down to. And that's what's being articulated here. This idea that this extreme imposition on women ultimately just comes down to your own inability to accept the fact that they are sexual beings, they have sexual desires like everybody else, and they have, whoever you have been with has most likely experimented sexually, has most likely tried all kinds of sexual things, and they've ultimately arrived at wanting to be with you. And one of the best explorations of this concept in fiction is in one of my favorite movies, which is Chasing Amy, the Kevin Smith movie. And spoiler alert for anyone who hasn't seen it, but it's about a man who falls in love with a woman that is ostensibly a lesbian. She is dishonest with him about whether or not she's ever been with a man. He thinks that he is her first man, and they fall madly in love. When they fall madly in love, eventually he thinks he is her first man. He is converted a lesbian, all of this. And what ultimately comes out, friends, he hears through the grapevine from friends of friends and everything, that in high school she was actually very promiscuous. She fucked around with a lot of men. She fucked around with a lot of men in college, fucked around with a lot of women, and ultimately arrived at arrived at thinking she was gay and just finally deciding she liked being with him better. And he couldn't accept that. He could not accept, again, Matt Walsh talks about if a man sees a woman who has behaved and meets a woman who's behaved in this way and is unrepentant about it, he will not want to be with that woman. And that's fundamentally the failure of character that's going on here. And the lesson, the morality, the moral lesson of the story comes in the form of a monologue from Silent Bob, where he talks about how he knew he once dated this girl, Amy, who he was really in love with, and they really cared about each other, really liked each other. And then he found out that she'd done a gangbang with 5 guys at one point, and he couldn't deal with that. He called her a slut. He broke up with her. And he realized that even though that was in her past and that was a part of who she was, ultimately where she was in her life then was wanting to be with him. And he could not deal with that. He could not deal with the feeling that this woman had had sexual experiences that he had not had, that she was more experienced than him, that she was more worldly than him, and that sort of thing. And that's the real, and the character in Chasing Amy, Holden McNeil, ultimately learns that very valuable lesson. It comes at the cost of losing the woman that he's in love with. But, and Silent Bob's point is, this girl, ever since then, he's been chasing Amy. He's been wishing he could have that relationship again, having learned the lessons that he's learned. And so that's the reality. That is a mature and realistic look at what it really means to accept somebody for all of their flaws, all of their positives and negatives, accepting the fact that no, they don't owe you an apology for their past. No, the idea of wanting your woman to repent of her past sins before she can be with you, she's not apologizing to God at that point. She's just apologizing to you by proxy. And she doesn't owe you an apology for who she was in the past any more than you owe her an apology for who she was in the past. And so that gets around to, I talked about, I know that my own Christian morality would be brought into question at this point. And fundamentally, this is something I've talked about in my videos, is that people oftentimes, in their interpretation of the Bible, and Matt Walsh is certainly a prime example of this, they take the Old Testament rules and they make their Christian morality about observing the rules, thinking, what rules do we have to observe? What boundaries do we have to observe in order to be good people? Christ's message consistently throughout the Bible was stop thinking about rules and start thinking about what's in your heart. Start proceeding from a place of genuine love and compassion for your neighbors, for your fellow man, your fellow humans, rather than thinking, oh, I did all the things listed in the rules, therefore I'm a good person. No, that's bullshit. You can do all the right things and still be a horrible human being. And so that attitude, the right attitude to take is that saying of, out of the overflow of the heart the mouth speaks. What is in your heart? What kind of person are you, and how do you treat people? So here's an example of how I would apply that to sexual morality. And I hate to bring this up, even though I'm not going to use names. I don't want to embarrass or insult anybody, and this is the person I'm talking about is somebody I do care about to some extent. I know, I've not interacted with her in a very long time, but I know of a woman who is in a situation where she's with a guy, her boyfriend, that she is being treated like a hot wife. They're not married, but he is aroused on the idea of her going around and fucking other men. He thinks that's really hot. He thinks it's really neat to have her go fuck other men, and she says that, when she comes home from getting fucked by another guy, he fucks her like nobody's business. He just loves the hell out of it. And here's the thing, though. She does not. I know that because I know her and I know her friends and all of that. I know that this woman in question is not happy in that situation. What she really, her real position, she feels like, she's not enjoying this promiscuous lifestyle that he's got her in. Rather, because she knows that this is his sexual fetish, she thinks if she commits herself to this, what he wants, going around and fucking whoever he tells her to fuck, that he will ultimately see that she's the right person for him and marry him, which obviously is never going to happen. Now, she is not happy. She is suffering because of this, but she keeps doing it because she's got this very codependent belief that he will marry her one day if she keeps fucking around, for his amusement. Now, here's the thing. Part of the reason I know about this is because the opportunity to be one of her partners, additional male partners, was open to me. I had that opportunity. And it was not directly expressed to me, but it was made clear to me through common acquaintances that all I had to do was ask, basically. The temptation was very much there. This beautiful woman, sexually available, sexually desirable, beautiful woman, and I got pretty close to acting on it, but I decided not to. And the reason I decided not to, I don't want to go into specifics and details, but ultimately the reason I decided not to participate or pursue that with her is because I knew that this was hurting her. I knew that she was not happy doing this. If she was happy, if she was fulfilled doing this, that might be one thing. Now, that said, I don't really personally want to be involved with the other guy is the issue. That's the other factor there. But if she had been happy doing this and enjoying it, that would have been one thing. But I knew that this was hurting her, and I knew that this was essentially an abusive situation where he was mistreating her and not taking her needs or desires into account, and she was just doing these things, going out and doing things that she hated doing for his amusement and for his pleasure and his enjoyment. And because that's a fundamentally abusive situation and she's being fundamentally mistreated there, that is something I decided not to participate in. To me, that's where we get into, when you want to talk about lust in your heart as committing adultery, that's to me what's really meant there. When you're behaving in a way that is hurting people. And that's not to say that I've never emotionally hurt anybody in relationships I've been in. Certainly I've been guilty of that, as we all will be at some point. But when you have that opportunity to not participate in something that, not further the pain and suffering of another human being, that is sexual morality. Knowing that that's not the right thing to do, it's not okay to, it hurts me to hurt this other person, and under those circumstances, I cannot engage in sexual congress with that person with a clean conscience. That's when you start calling sexual morality into question. And you start, rather than thinking of in terms of this person is doing this act, therefore they're a bad person, rather we should turn it around on its head and say, what is doing this bringing out in the person? And that's where Matt Walsh will always say that it's always going to be fundamentally negative. It's always going to bring out something negative in the person unless they're in a committed relationship and they're only fucking to have babies. Because, again, Matt Walsh is so solipsistic, he cannot conceive of anyone that's happy doing anything other than what he approves of. But at the end of the day, that's what sexual morality, in my mind, should really consist of. It should consist of asking yourself, what am I doing in this situation? What effect is it having on other people? And is that effect fundamentally positive? And again, asking that question may in many cases lead you to declining otherwise available sexual interactions. But it should proceed from what's in your heart rather than just ticking off the boxes on a sheet of rules. So anyway, hopefully that makes some sense. Let me know what you think in the comments. Take care.